My brother Michael dumped an entire glass of Cabernet Sauvignon on my head, a vicious act of public spite, and then hissed, "You have exactly 15 minutes to leave my family's party before I have security drag you out." He froze, his self-satisfied smirk crumbling into sheer, paralyzing terror, when I opened my mouth and exposed him for the fraud he truly was. The moment it happened, the music at the annual Chicago Founders Gala stopped, the silence echoing through the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, heavier and more damning than any sound. It wasn't the ruin of my evening I was worried about. I was a 34-year-old corporate M&A lawyer, not a debutante, and the wine merely ruined an expensive ivory silk dress. What truly broke me was the way my mother, Laura, watched the dark liquid drip from my freshly styled hair down my face and onto the costly fabric, and simply sighed, "Michael, clean this up quickly. You're making a scene, and this is your father's big night." There was no concern for me, no shock at the aggression, just mild irritation that the golden child had messed up the flawless optics of his triumphant coronation. The entire night had been leading to this moment, a carefully orchestrated public announcement where my father, James Hayes, was officially handing over the reins of Hayes Logistics, the family trucking and warehousing business, to Michael. I was there, of course, because I am Jessica Hayes, the invisible daughter, the silent fixer, the one who stepped in to save the business from 2 near bankruptcies and 1 aggressive IRS audit, all caused by Michael's staggering incompetence, but whose reward was a complimentary ticket and a seat at table 12, strategically placed out of sight, near the service entrance. I was the contingency plan, the ghost in the machine, but never the inheritor. I wiped the cold, sticky wine from my eyes, and the first thing I saw was Michael's face, smug and triumphant. He had just finished his toast, a rambling, self-congratulatory speech where he'd managed to mention his visionary leadership 4 times and my quiet, supportive role in administrative affairs once. The wine was the final punctuation mark on a decade of casual, institutionalized cruelty. He thought he was shaming me into leaving. He thought he was humiliating the black sheep one last time in front of the Chicago elite who all bought into the perfect Hayes narrative. I reached inside my small sequined clutch, the one Michael had mocked earlier for being too plain and not flashy enough for a gala, and pulled out a legal folder, the expensive kind, with a discreet Manhattan law firm's seal debossed on the cover. My hands were perfectly steady. The wine running down my chin felt like baptism into a colder, clearer reality. 15 minutes, Michael? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying across the suddenly silent room with lethal precision. My pitch was low and calm, the voice of an attorney who knew she held every card. "I don't think so. I think you have 15 minutes before the marshal's office serves you." My mother's hand fluttered to her chest, her carefully constructed composure faltering for the first time. My father, who had been chatting with the state senator, finally turned around, his face etched with confusion and raw, dangerous annoyance. He hated conflict, especially conflict that jeopardized his image and this public crowning. "Jessica, what in God's name is the meaning of this? You're ruining everything!" he snapped, his eyes flashing with the familiar disappointment he reserved solely for me. Michael, however, wasn't confused now. He recognized the tone in my voice, the quiet authority I used when I was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals in my actual life, the one the family preferred to ignore. But the underlying threat in the phrase "Marshal's office" hit him like a physical blow. I didn't acknowledge my father. I looked straight at Michael, who had just tried to physically push me out of a room that, as of 9 p.m., was now legally mine. "You're going to want to sit down for this, Michael," I said, my smile finally widening, but devoid of warmth. I handed the heavy, bound document to my father. It was a formal notification of a hostile takeover and the execution of key debt covenants, complete with signatures from the majority of secured debt holders, the largest of which was listed under a shell corporation, Ethelred Acquisitions. James Hayes, the man who had always valued reputation over reality, glanced at the letterhead and his face went instantly pale. He knew Ethelred. Everyone in Chicago's financial circles knew they were the ruthless financial vultures who bought up toxic assets and disassembled them for parts. What he didn't know was that Ethelred was the holding company founded and controlled by my friend, business partner, and most loyal ally Jack Thorne, and I was its chief operating officer. "Jessica," my father croaked, his voice strained and thin. "This letter says Ethelred controls 72% of the senior debt and has executed a call option on Michael's preferred shares." Michael, who had been frozen since my initial comeback, finally defrosted, but only to panic. He lunged for the document, shouting a desperate denial that echoed through the ballroom. "That's impossible. I paid off that debt. I retired those shares last quarter." His loud, desperate denial drew every eye in the room, sealing his fate as the center of the unfolding disaster. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting the wine finish its sad, crimson journey down my neck. They thought they'd won, but I had an ace up my sleeve, and that moment changed everything. The next morning, I woke up in my own sleek, modern condo in River North Chicago, the lingering scent of stale Merlot, a strange perfume of victory. The physical humiliation was still fresh, the silk dress discarded, but it was overshadowed by a quiet, steel resolve. I knew what I had to do, and more importantly, I finally had the power and the leverage to do it. The memory of Michael's petulant, entitled cruelty, endorsed by my parents' passive acceptance, wasn't new. It was merely the climax of a toxic dynamic that had defined my entire life. Growing up in the sprawling Texas suburbs, the kind with 3-car garages, a meticulously manicured lawn, and a crippling need for appearances, Michael was the anointed prince, and I was the dutiful squire, albeit a highly competent, perpetually overlooked one. Michael was the charming, athletic son, destined to take over Hayes Logistics and uphold the family name. I was the academically gifted, meticulous daughter whose achievements were always qualified, always viewed through the lens of supporting Michael's true path. Jessica got into Yale Law, but Michael is building a business, forging the future, my mother would tell the ladies at the country club, conveniently omitting that Michael's building consisted primarily of spending the capital I'd helped secure and hiring friends who couldn't find the delivery dock with a map, let alone manage a fleet. My sacrifice wasn't a single event. It was a series of calculated self-denials spanning nearly a decade that derailed my own, highly promising American dream. I'd deferred a coveted partnership track at a major New York law firm, a multi-million-dollar opportunity, not once, but twice, to return to Chicago and clean up the financial messes Michael had created. The first time was 7 years ago, right after I passed the New York bar. Michael, high on his own vision, had plunged the company into an ill-advised, over-leveraged expansion into the Southwest. He'd ignored compliance, nearly violated multiple interstate commerce regulations, and brought the company to its knees with a catastrophic liquidity crisis. I flew home, spent 6 months navigating the legal and financial labyrinth, restructured nearly $50 million in senior debt, and personally negotiated forbearance agreements with 5 major banks. It was a Herculean effort that saved the Hayes name from public shame and protected every family asset. My reward? A terse, grateful nod from my father, who then immediately approved the purchase of a new, ridiculously luxurious SUV for Michael to boost his morale after his setback. They never once acknowledged that I had sacrificed my trajectory for theirs. The second time was 3 years ago, a far more dangerous crisis when the company faced an existential threat from that aggressive IRS audit. It was a direct result of Michael's aggressive, bordering on fraudulent tax maneuvers designed to look great on paper, but functionally illegal. The audit stretched over 8 brutal months. I was the one who spent 80-hour weeks in windowless government rooms with forensic auditors, meticulously tracing every penny, strategically sacrificing minor subsidiaries to save the core business. I navigated the labyrinthine tax code, mitigating hundreds of thousands in fines and averting potential criminal charges for the family. I successfully protected the Hayes name and its assets, performing a masterclass in financial triage. My reward that time was less tangible. Michael stopped speaking to me for 6 months because I'd dared to question his methods and embarrassed him in front of the board by presenting factual financial data. The deep-seated favoritism wasn't just irritating, it was institutionalized, a core pathology of the Hayes family business. Every time I brought up a strategic financial decision, presented an opportunity for modernization, or suggested a necessary cost-cutting measure, my father would wave me off with, "Let Michael handle the vision, Jess. You stick to the details." The details, of course, were the life support system, the daily grind of ethics and compliance that kept the company solvent. My contributions were essential, yet invisible. The betrayal, however, became utterly unforgivable 2 years ago, right when I was finally ready to accept the New York partnership, sever the umbilical cord, and move on for good. It was Thanksgiving, and the family was gathered for the obligatory turkey, stuffing, and apple pie at my parents' sprawling Dallas home. The kind of day where the veneer of family perfection was stretched thin over years of resentments. I slipped away to the den to take a private call, but found Michael and my mother, Laura, discussing the family trust updates. Michael, in his usual arrogant drawl, his voice laced with casual cruelty, said, "Make sure the updated trust language is airtight, Mom. Jessica's too smart, she'll try to find a loophole once Dad is gone. We need to make sure she's limited to that 5% minority stake and nothing else. She's too much of a risk to the real legacy and the company direction." My mother, Laura, responded with a chilling, pragmatic voice, devoid of emotion. "Don't worry, darling. Your father and I have ensured your control is absolute. Your sister is brilliant, yes, but she lacks the passion for the family name. 5% is generous enough compensation for her cleanup work." I walked away from that den, the scent of cinnamon and betrayal thick in the air, overpowering the sweet smell of the holiday meal. Cleanup work. That's all I was. I felt a cold, calculated fury replace the usual dull ache of being second best. That was the pivotal moment. The moment I stopped being the dutiful daughter and started being the ruthless corporate shark I was trained to be. I didn't confront them then. I smiled, ate my pie, and watched the Super Bowl pregame show with my father, acting as if I hadn't just heard my life's work dismissed and stolen, and my financial future capped. I went back to New York, but I didn't take the partnership. I took an indefinite sabbatical. I knew I couldn't fight the family in court directly, without sacrificing years and all my remaining emotional reserves, but I could beat them on the battlefield of finance, a place where their arrogance, their belief in their own superiority, was my greatest weapon. I immediately called Jack Thorne, my former M&A partner and current business confidant. Jack was a force of nature, a brilliant financial mind with a reputation for merciless ethical takeovers. He was wealthy, powerful, and utterly loyal to me, a relationship built on mutual respect, not blood. We met at a quiet, unpretentious bar on the Upper East Side, the kind of place where a single martini costs more than Michael's weekly gas budget for his oversized company SUV. "They're trying to cut me out entirely, Jack. 5% and a handshake for saving their collective asses 3 times, I told him, sipping my drink, my voice calm despite the fire in my stomach. Jack, a tall, intense man with sharp blue eyes, listened without judgment, a slight smirk playing on his lips as I recounted the Thanksgiving betrayal. "Hayes Logistics has high leverage. Michael probably hasn't paid close attention to the covenants on that senior secured debt you restructured years ago," he mused, tapping the rim of his glass. "What if the cleanup wasn't quite finished, Jesse?" My plan was born that night, elegant in its simplicity and lethal in its execution, based on the specific flawed nature of Michael's financial management. He was a spender and a showman. He hated paperwork and details. The senior secured debt I had restructured years ago had complex covenants, triggered by minor technical breaches and staggered payment dates. Michael focused on his latest shiny toy, a new fleet of unnecessarily large, customized semi-trucks for the aesthetic he loved to show off at trade shows, had clearly overlooked critical technical defaults that, on their own, were small, but collectively triggered major clauses. Working under the umbrella of Jack's firm, Unauthorized Acquisitions, I spent the next 22 months operating in complete professional silence. My professional specialty was hostile takeovers and financial forensics, the very skill set they trained me for but never expected me to use against them. I used my deep, insider knowledge of Hayes Logistics' debt structure to systematically buy up the minor debt tranches that Michael had defaulted on. Technical defaults that allowed the entire debt facility to be called, or the creditor to demand preferred equity conversion. Michael, arrogant and convinced of his own untouchable position, simply ignored the notices, assuming they were low-priority legal spam or just minor billing errors. He never looked at the letterhead or the specific clauses cited. I traveled under the radar, from the steel and glass towers of New York to the smaller private equity shops in Boston, meeting with small-time bank creditors and hedge funds who held pieces of Hayes Logistics' debt. I presented them with detailed, unassailable financial forecasts showing that Michael was running the company into the ground and offered them a 10% premium to sell their debt to Ethelred, payable in cash immediately. Jack provided the vast capital and the high-level legal cover, giving me the authority to execute the deals, signing documents simply as J. Hayes, CFO, Ethelred subsidiary, a name that meant nothing to them but everything to me. The biggest move was securing the preferred shares. I discovered Michael had carelessly allowed a sizable block of these non-voting shares to be held as collateral for a ridiculously high-interest short-term loan, a loan he used to buy that ridiculous new fleet of flashy, personalized trucks. Using a shell company in Delaware, I bought the loan from the originator and immediately called the collateral due to a technical missed payment on the interest, giving Ethelred control of the preferred shares and their associated voting rights in case of default. I was playing chess while they were playing checkers, moving lethal pieces in the dark while they basked in the spotlight of their self-congratulatory world. The family was so certain of my insignificance, so confident in their system of favoritism, that they never even considered me a threat. They didn't check the public filings. They didn't look behind the veil of Ethelred. Why would they? Jessica was the fixer, not the predator. She only handled the details. My work culminated 3 weeks before the gala. I had quietly amassed 72% of the total outstanding senior debt and, crucially, secured the voting rights on the preferred shares, enough to make me the single controlling financial entity over Hayes Logistics. I wasn't waiting for a will. I was executing a corporate maneuver that bypassed the entire family trust. I was taking my rightful inheritance now, using the very legal structure I was once forced to protect. I had used their rules against them, and the irony was delicious. The initial confrontation, post-gala shock, took place the very next afternoon at my father's plush, oak-paneled office in downtown Chicago, a sanctuary of old money power. Michael and my parents were waiting for me, the air thick with tension and the smell of fear mixed with expensive cologne. Michael's earlier panic had curdled into sputtering, entitled rage. "You're trying to extort us, Jessica. This is slander, and I'll have you disbarred. You used confidential information," he yelled, slamming his hand on the antique mahogany desk. My mother sat beside him, coolly composed but with a telltale tremor in her hand as she desperately clung to her Louis Vuitton bag. My father, James, looked genuinely weary, his dream of a smooth succession shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Extortion requires a demand, Michael," I replied, sitting opposite them, completely composed in a sharp black suit, having meticulously washed the cheap wine out of my hair. I had a court reporter present, tucked away discreetly, in the corner, recording every word, something I insisted on for legal clarity and future litigation. "I'm not demanding anything. I'm simply informing you of a change in corporate control." I pushed a bound, leather-cased document across the table. It was the formal agreement between Ethelred Acquisitions and the former creditors. As of midnight last night, Ethelred Acquisitions, which I control, officially executed a debt-to-equity swap option on the defaulted tranches of the secured debt. We also exercised the call option on the preferred shares, due to material and continuing breaches of covenant, specifically Michael's repeated, egregious failure to maintain a 1.5 debt service coverage ratio for the last 4 consecutive quarters. Michael's face was truly priceless. He didn't even know what a debt service coverage ratio was, let alone how to calculate it. He'd never bothered to learn the technical finance that kept his lavish lifestyle afloat. He looked at my father for help, but James, who was finally reading the fine print of the agreements I had written years ago, just shook his head slowly. The covenants you wrote, Jessica," James muttered, his voice defeated, realizing the elegant trap I had set. "You used the very protections you put in place to save us, to take us over." "Exactly," I confirmed calmly. "I protect my investments, Father. Hayes Logistics was my investment, of time, expertise, and emotional capital. I wasn't compensated for it fairly, so I acquired the compensation myself, through the only language you understand, financial power." My mother finally spoke, her voice laced with the cold venom she usually reserved for the staff, attempting to throw shade at my character. "You wouldn't dare liquidate the company, Jessica. It's our family's legacy. You're a Hayes. You would destroy your own history? Just for spite?" She tried to invoke the very loyalty they had exploited for years. I simply smiled, a genuine, cold-as-ice smile. "Legacy, Mom?" "The legacy Michael was running into the ground while using the company jet for tailgating parties every Sunday during football season? The legacy that I personally saved from the IRS? The real legacy is the 2,000 employees and their families whose livelihoods are tied to this company. Ethelred is a responsible corporate entity. We will restructure and sell the viable parts to a competitor who won't treat the company like a personal piggy bank. As for destroying history, I'm not destroying it, I'm redefining it. I'm cleaning up the mess, one last time, permanently." The confrontations continued over the next few weeks, moving from the polished offices to a less formal but equally tense meeting at a quiet, upscale restaurant in Nashville, a neutral ground for our Texas-Chicago dynamic. The family, desperate, tried everything: emotional pleas, outright legal threats, and public smear campaigns, attempting to spill the tea on me in social circles, hinting that I was unstable and attempting a hostile takeover fueled by unreasonable sibling rivalry. They even got a local Chicago columnist to write a piece questioning my mental state. My father even tried to use our history, bringing up childhood memories of me helping Michael with his miserable science projects and covering for him when he crashed the golf cart. "Where is your heart, Jessica?" he pleaded over a dismal plate of burnt burgers and cold fries. "Don't you believe in the American dream, in family, in forgiveness?" "I believe in the American dream of meritocracy, Father, the idea that hard work and competence prevail. And I believe in my own resilience," I retorted, placing my knife down with a soft, final clink. "And Michael?" I turned my gaze to him, his eyes already shifting nervously. "Michael believes in taking the credit and throwing shade at the people who actually do the work. Remember the time he claimed credit for that new logistics software that increased efficiency by 30%? I stayed up for 3 weeks programming that. You gave him a $50,000 bonus, and you told me to be a good sport." I paused, letting the bitterness sting. My heart left the day I heard you call my work cleanup and my steak generous enough compensation at the Thanksgiving table. That was the last time I allowed myself to be emotionally manipulated by this family. You taught me the value of leverage, not love. Michael was becoming increasingly frayed. The calm, controlled demeanor I maintained, even under their relentless pressure, was terrifying to him because it reflected true power, something he only pretended to possess. They were used to my compliance. My refusal to bend was their downfall. The final piece of the puzzle came together when I brought in Jack for a formal meeting. We met at his spectacular open-plan office in Midtown Manhattan, overlooking Central Park, a stark contrast to the dated Chicago offices of Hayes Logistics. They are threatening to sue on grounds of fiduciary misconduct, Jess. They're arguing you used proprietary information acquired during your fixer roles to engineer the takeover, Jack summarized, leaning back in his chair. It's a weak argument, but it's noise. It delays the inevitable. We need to go past noise, Jack. We need to go past the takeover, I said, looking out at the glittering cityscape, already mapping out the next phase. I need to ensure Michael never touches a publicly traded asset again. He's not just incompetent, he's criminally negligent. I knew from my years cleaning up his messes, especially the IRS audit, that Michael had used a complex web of shell companies, including that Delaware one I used to acquire the preferred shares, and creative accounting to systematically divert company funds for personal use, specifically covering his exorbitant lifestyle and purchasing assets like that ridiculously expensive customized trucking fleet. This was the dark secret, the real crime that would make him freeze. It was tax evasion and potential wire fraud, a far more serious threat than corporate debt default. I had a meticulously constructed digital dossier, recordings, emails, and bank statements I'd compiled, not during the takeover, but years ago, during the very IRS audit I saved him from. I had kept the evidence, the ultimate insurance policy. He had confessed his fraudulent actions to me in a panicked late-night call years ago, a cry for help that I had, out of professional instinct and self-preservation, recorded. It was the ace up my sleeve. The audio file, along with corresponding digital copies of the fraudulent ledgers, was stored on a secured, encrypted USB drive I nicknamed the Ace. The family was operating under the illusion that the fight was over corporate control and money. I was about to drop the bombshell that the fight was actually over criminal liability, a direct path to a federal indictment. My loyalties were now clear. To justice, to the integrity of the financial system, and to the employees of Hayes Logistics who deserved stable, ethical leadership. The days of me sacrificing my career and integrity for their comfort were over. I was about to teach them the real price of underestimating the quiet daughter. The climax unfolded not at a stuffy, formal board meeting, but back at the scene of the crime, the Drake Hotel, in a small, private conference room the family often used for pre-gala meetings, now strangely quiet and sterile. I orchestrated the setting, a simple mahogany table, a high-definition projector, and just 4 people. Myself, my parents, Michael, and a sharp, neutral lawyer named Linda, provided by Jack from Ethelred. I had insisted on this meeting, promising a final resolution before the lawyers got fully involved in a messy, public battle. They came, desperate and thinking they could still appeal to my family loyalty and negotiate a price. Jessica, this ends now," my father began, his voice flat with forced authority, trying to sound like the CEO he used to be. "We're offering you 20% of the trust assets immediately, plus full reimbursement for your work. You walk away from Ethelred, we sell the debt back to the original bank, and we salvage the company. You get your money, and we get our name back. Deal?" He believed he was making a generous peacemaking offer. Michael stood behind him, trying to project confidence but constantly checking his phone, a nervous habit he developed under stress. No deal," I replied simply, my voice ringing with finality as I placed the Ace, a sleek metallic USB drive, in the dead center of the mahogany table. "I didn't come here to negotiate a payout, Father. I came here to finalize the consequences of your collective actions. You prioritized Michael's ambition over competence, and Mom prioritized his comfort over integrity. The price of that decision is the dissolution of Hayes Logistics and Michael's immediate involuntary resignation." Michael scoffed, leaning forward with aggressive denial. "I'll never resign. You have no grounds to force me out, and your legal maneuvering is weak. You won the company, sure, but you can't touch my personal assets, my name, or my freedom." "Oh, but I can, Michael," I said, my voice rising just slightly to cut through his arrogant bluster. The takeover, as you call it, was the corporate action. This is the personal one. I nodded to Linda, who plugged the USB drive into the laptop connected to the projector. The screen flashed to life, displaying a simple folder hierarchy. Hayes Logistics, Critical Audit Files. M. Hayes Personal Liability. IRS, 2022. Audit Files. Michael Hayes, Personal. The room was instantly silent, the air cold. My parents exchanged frantic, panicked looks, clearly unaware that I had kept anything, believing that all the messy paperwork was shredded years ago after the audit was successfully closed. I clicked on an audio file named MH Confession September 12, 2022. The sound quality was tinny, but clear enough for the horror to sink in. Michael's voice, panicked and tearful, filled the small conference room. Jessica, listen to me. I need you to bury that subsidiary's ledger. I used it as collateral for the trucks and didn't declare the income from the Chicago terminal sales last year. It's all tied up? 6 figures. If the IRS finds out about the shell company transactions and the undeclared revenue, they'll go straight for wire fraud and tax evasion. It's 5 years in a federal prison, Jess. Please. You're the only one who can make this disappear. You're the lawyer. The color drained from Michael's face, a sickening visible change from arrogant crimson to ashen white. He stumbled backward, his hands grasping for the chair he had already abandoned, his mouth open in a silent scream of disbelief. He was no longer the smug prince from the gala. He was a terrified little boy whose biggest, dirtiest secret, the confession of a felony, was exposed on a high-definition screen. He froze, his jaw slack, when I exposed him. That call, I explained calmly, my voice cutting through the ringing silence as my mother gasped, and my father stared aghast, his empire crumbling before his eyes. Occurred 2 years ago, when I was home cleaning up his tax disaster. He was begging me to commit a crime, to bury evidence of his fraud for the sake of his new truck aesthetic. I, of course, refused. But I kept the record. As COO of Ethelred, I have a fiduciary duty to disclose any material irregularities in the acquired assets, especially those involving potential criminal behavior. Michael's continued fraudulent behavior and misuse of company funds is a massive, uninsurable liability. Linda, I gestured to the lawyer who offered a small professional nod, is here to confirm that this evidence, coupled with the detailed financial records I provided to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Chicago State Attorney's Office this morning, constitutes multiple counts of federal and state-level financial crimes. He's looking at significant jail time, Dad, not just a lawsuit. The takeover was simply the vehicle for the public disclosure. My mother shrieked, the sound raw and desperate, breaking the last vestiges of her socialite composure. You can't do this! He's your brother! You're sending your own flesh and blood to prison! No, Mom, I said, finally letting the full force of my long-suppressed anger come out, sharp and decisive. I'm not sending him anywhere. He drove himself there with his own greed and incompetence. I merely stopped driving the getaway car. You and Dad enabled a criminal and punished the one child who kept your business afloat. I learned the hard way that loyalty is a two-way street, and the path you paved for Michael was paved with my sacrifices and my suppressed integrity. My father collapsed into his chair, covering his face with his hands, his entire life's focus. The name, the reputation, the legacy, disintegrating into dust. The name, the reputation, he whispered, the sound a ragged echo of defeat. The aftermath was swift and devastating for the Hayes family. The legal action from the state of Illinois and federal agencies moved fast once the unassailable documentation was presented. Michael was formally indicted for tax evasion and wire fraud a month later. He was forced to resign immediately and faced years of ruinous legal battles, the forfeiture of his personal assets purchased with fraudulently diverted funds, and a high probability of criminal conviction. My mother and father, the enablers, were publicly disgraced. The Chicago Founders Gala was the last time they were seen among the city's financial elite. The public shunning was absolute and brutal. Their attempts to spill the tea on me only backfired as I released simple, factual statements to the press, highlighting my role in protecting the company's pension funds. Hayes Logistics, unable to weather the combined storm of the hostile takeover, the public scandal, and Michael's legal woes, was put into ethical receivership by Ethelred. I personally oversaw the entire liquidation process, ensuring the 2,000 employees, the families I truly cared about, were protected, securing generous severance packages and facilitating the sale of the core assets to a responsible, ethical competitor who valued their workforce. I took the last laugh, securing not just my financial independence but my moral high ground. The Hayes family lost everything they valued: the prestige, the company, and the comfort of their suburban bubble. They finally understood what it meant to be powerless, a feeling they had unjustly forced upon me for decades. I was the one who got the upper hand and the hand of justice. 6 months later, I officially stepped down from Ethelred, having completed the most satisfying, complex assignment of my career. Jack and I immediately executed our long-planned partnership, opening our own boutique financial restructuring firm, Astra Strategy, specializing in ethical, sustainable corporate turnarounds and M&A. We chose San Francisco, a city of innovation and reinvention, as far philosophically from the rigid, toxic, old money structure of my Chicago childhood as possible. I purchased a beautiful, modern home high up in the Bay Area, with a stunning panoramic view of the ocean, the perfect symbol of the vast, open future stretching before me. I took my shot and rebuilt my life. I was no longer the fixer, perpetually cleaning up after others, but the founder. My work wasn't cleanup, it was creation, creating value where others saw only toxic assets. I found an immense satisfaction in applying my intelligence to build something that was truly mine, free from the crushing weight of family obligation and emotional blackmail. I focused on projects that empowered me and others, proving that money and power, when wielded by the right person, are tools for justice, integrity, and renewal, not just oppression. My name, Jessica Hayes, was now associated with competence, ruthlessness, and an unshakable moral center. My mother tried to call me once. "Your brother is going to prison, Jessica," she sobbed into the phone. "How can you live with yourself?" I simply replied, "I live with myself just fine, Mom. I followed the law, which is more than Michael ever did. This is what standing up for yourself looks like." I hung up the phone, placed it back in its sleek cradle, and never looked back. That was my final act of severance, the clean cut I needed to fully embrace my freedom. One lazy Saturday afternoon, nearly a year after the gala, Jack and I were sitting on my sunny back deck overlooking the Pacific, the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the hazy distance, a symbol of impossible engineering and new beginnings. We were sipping artisanal coffee, talking about a potential acquisition in Silicon Valley, and for the first time in my life, I felt pure, unadulterated peace. "You know, Jessica," Jack said, his eyes reflecting the shimmering bay water, "your dad asked me why you did it, right before he finally filed for bankruptcy. Why you didn't just take the 20% and run." I took a long sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him he messed with the wrong daughter," Jack replied, a slight, knowing smile playing on his lips. "And that you weren't looking for money, though you took plenty. You were looking for justice, for recognition, and more importantly, for the chance to define yourself on your own terms. That's the real American dream, Jess. The ability to tell a toxic past to get lost and build your own damn future." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes against the warm California sun. My family had tried to drown me in wine and shame at that gala, but they only succeeded in washing away the last vestiges of my self-doubt. I was strong, independent, and utterly free, navigating the complex waters of a life I had earned, not inherited. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for any black-tie Chicago gala. My new chapter had begun, and this time I was writing every single word, and it was a masterpiece of my own making.